again, everybody, and welcome back to WOT Blitz, and this is part 2 of Real Tanks, a brief history of Soviet TDs. Now, in part 1 we looked at all the TDs that start at tier 2 and end at tier 6, and in this part we're going to look at those funky TDs that start at tier 7 and end in tier X. So to kick us off, we start with this tank, the SU-152. In the game, this is a tier 7 Soviet tank destroyer, and in real life it did exist. It was also a Soviet tank destroyer. Now, basically, the Russians, had we seen in part 1, had already been developing TDs, but when they started Operation Uranus, which was the attack to push the Germans and surround them at Stalingrad, they realised they were overly exposed with a lack of heavy guns, especially when they wanted to knock out fortifications. So, like any good Blitz player, the Soviet Union wanted more derp. It's that straightforward. Now, they already had a derpy gun that dealt with fortifications, namely this, the KV-2, with its massive 154.2mm M10 Howitzer. But it wasn't enough. Not only that, they'd ceased producing these things. In fact, that picture there is the only existing KV-2 on the planet, and it's at the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow, which is a very lovely place to visit. Now, it was already established that that gun was okay. But the problem was they were running out of KV-2s. Not only that, they had found a better gun, which was now Howitzer, namely this gun, the M10 Howitzer, which was a colossal derp gun. However, it was only 152mm, slightly shorter, but it had a longer barrel and it had a better overall effect than the 154.2mm in the KV-2. The only problem that the Russians had was that they wanted to marry this gun to this tank. This is the KV-1S. That is a picture of a restored version, and I've already dealt with the KV-1 and KV-1S variants in a different video, but for those of you who missed that, basically it's a little bit more armoured and it's got a different turret, as you can see. That is a KV-1S at Patriot Park in Kubinka, Russia, that I took, and it's a beautiful looking tank, and it's pretty big, to be fair. Back to the tank. They wanted to marry that massive M10 Howitzer to this hull. It ain't going to fit in that turret, and they quickly established it was never going to fit in this turret. So the Russians were at a bit of a loss, so they asked for 3 designs, all based on the KV-1S chassis, which they had quite a few of. Now, the program itself was called the Pillbox Killer Tank Program, oddly enough, and they came up with a couple of designs and they called it the KV-14. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of it. The KV-14 was then morphed into a specific project after one design was seen to be suitable, and that design morphed into this tank, the OSU-236. It is a prototype of the SU-152 that we now know and love. So this tank underwent lots of trials and it was found to be a really good tank. So they changed the designation from KV-14 and changed it to this, the SU-152. They modified the gun slightly, they modified the mounting slightly. Now, the thing about Soviet TDs at this stage, they weren't designed to fire armor piercing. They were never meant to be anti-tank guns. They were meant to literally be fortification killers. But the Russians during the trials found out that this thing, by pure fluke, was absolutely amazing in an anti-tank role. It only fired HE, however, but this tank at quite some distance could literally decapitate a Tiger 1. It would, with its blast, and its blast alone from the high explosive, it would take the turret clean off the hull of a Tiger. It was the only Russian tank that could do that. I mean, it was absolutely outrageous. The Russians, however, did discover that defensively this tank was pretty pants, so they did stick in a DSHK 12.7mm anti-tank gun, which was developed in 1943, but only a few of them had it fitted. This was the last tank of the KV family. Now it was eventually replaced by something else, but more about that later. This tank was finally withdrawn from Russian service in 1954. Now it gets a bit tricky. Next up in the game we have this tank, the SU-100M1. Now this is where it gets a bit confusing. This tank never actually existed. Basically, the Uralmash Design Bureau designed 5 tanks, of which this tank, the SU-100M1, was one of those tanks. And basically what they did, they took an SU-100. They'd thought that the design flaw in that tank was basically having the casemate at the front. It made it very difficult to maneuver, so they put the casemate at the rear, kept it on a T-34 chassis, and made it easier to maneuver around forests and in towns. But that's as far as it went. It never got designed any further. It is similar to a Uralmash-1 tank, but it is not the same. Therefore, there are no pictures of this tank. They don't exist. So, unfortunately, this is a tank that never existed. But, moving on, we now get to this tank, the SU-12244. In the game, this is a Russian Tier 7 TD also, and it also emanated as one of the 5 projects coming out of the Uralmash Design Bureau. Now, this tank was basically based on a T-44 chassis. It had similar design as the SU-100, but it mounted a 122mm gun. So it's based on this tank, which is a T-44. That particular tank is a restored T-44 that sits in Brest in Belarus. And what they did, they took the casemate because they liked the design of the SU-100. They took that casemate design, modified it a bit, plonked it on the top of this thing, and stuck a massive whopping great gun in it. Problem was, it had major design flaws. In fact, it was too heavy. There is a picture of the prototype of, and the actual design was far inferior to another tank, which I'm going to have to now skip the game TD tiers and move to a tier 8 tank. So we move now to the SU-101, the Russian tier 8 TD in the game. Now, as you can see, this bears a striking similarity to the SU-100M1, a tank that, whilst it was conceived as a design, never even made it to prototype and therefore never existed. Now, this tank is very much the same tank, oddly enough. The only difference between this one, its real designation is actually the SU-100M2, and it has a bigger gun on a T-44 hull. In real life, it only had a 100mm gun. In the game, it's got a bigger gun, namely the 122mm. Now, the thing is, in real life, this tank was just a prototype, and this is how it started, the Uralmash-1. Now, that particular prototype is what we have in the game as the SU-100M1. It is the 100mm version. Now, the thing is, if this would have made it past prototype, it wouldn't have ever been called the SU-100M1. It would have been called the SU-101. And there's the prototype there, sat in the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia. Now, only one of these type of tanks, the 100mm, was ever made. The other prototype was the 122mm, which, had that have gone to prototype, would have actually been called the SU-102. So, wargaming have slightly got muddled up here. The SU-100M1 would have actually been the SU-101, and this version, which is the SU-101, would have actually been the SU-102. Thing is, the prototypes never made it off the drawing board, and the project was shelved in 1945, so these are tanks that never were. Now I've got to jump around a bit, so I'm now going to jump to the next tank, which is another tier 8 TD in the game. This tank, the ISU-152, the Russian tier 8 tank destroyer. Now, this tank realistically was developed from the SU-152. But if you go back, you remember the SU-152 is based on the KV family series chassis. Well, they'd run out by this time of the war, so they needed to upgrade it, and the tank that replaced the KV was the IS. So the first tank to be developed was actually the IS-152, which was basically the casemate and the 152mm gun plonked on top of an IS chassis. That didn't really work though as a prototype. Major design flaws. So they had to go back and rejig it all. And they did, and they came up with this, the ISU-152. And this is a picture that I took of an ISU-152 at the Great Patriotic War Museum in Moscow. The thing about this tank was, as I said, it's basically a similar design to an SU-152, just on a different chassis, that of the IS series of tanks. This tank actually saw service all the way up until the 1970s, and it went through various variation changes, which we will get to. Main difference being, however, and there's another ISU at Kubinka that I saw. Main difference with this tank between the SU is, as I said, it's got a similar casemate with similar armour, it's just on an IS chassis. It has the same gun, basically, and the same parameters as the SU, just a different chassis, guys. Now we have to jump back a little bit, unfortunately, back to a Tier 7 tank, namely this tank, the ISU-122S, as it is in the game. Now, the reason why I've had to jump back to Tier 2 is because this tank was developed after the ISU-152. Now, what happened was, they took the ISU-152 and they decided to mount a different gun on it. In fact, they decided to mount the A19 gun, which is basically a 122mm gun. And they designated that tank the Obj-242, and there is the Obj-242 there, and this was the prototype for the ISU-122. Now, as I said, this tank comes after the ISU-152, but because it's got a smaller caliber, it's seen as a Tier 7 in the game rather than a Tier 8, bizarrely, despite the fact it came after it, time-wise. The thing is, it had a much faster reload, and it was quite a good tank. And they experimented even further and came up with this. This is an ISU-122S, and the difference between the ISU-122 and the 122S is just the mounting for the gun, where they took the A19, made it kind of semi-automatic, and designated the D25S gun. That's where the S comes from. Now, the only way you can tell the difference is because of the muzzle brake and the ball mounting on the turret. And that is it. Aside from that, it's basically the same tank. So, staying still at Tier 8, we now move to this tank, the ISU-130. Now, oddly enough, this tank did actually exist. There isn't many details on this tank. Basically, it's another ISU-152 with a different gun. It's the same casemate and the same IS chassis. The difference being they've shoved in a 130mm gun into this beastie. Basically, it was a prototype. It was never seriously considered as a tank, and it never really had the name ISU-130. Its actual name was Object-250, and there is a picture of the Object-250 in Kubinka with a massively long gun, which was totally impractical. I mean, they already discovered that the SU-100 was impractical, and that had a 100mm gun. It was pretty large. This thing was never going to get round forests or buildings because the gun was just too long. But staying with the IS family, we now jump to this tank, the Object-704, the Russian Tier 9 tank destroyer. Now, this is an interesting tank. This is only a prototype, only one was ever made, and again it's based on the IS chassis, and it was intended to be an upgrade to the ISU-152, strangely enough. Now, in real life, it had the stubby little gun of the ISU-152, which was the 52.4mm short barrel, and there's a picture of the prototype there when it was first coming out, just after the war. The thing is, They also redesigned the casemate to make it more shot deflective and give better protection. Problem was, they overcooked it, and it was absolutely abysmal for the crew inside. It was far too complex, so they shelved the project. Only one prototype was made. That is a picture of the only prototype that was made, and it still survives. And there it is there, sat in the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia. Staying with Tier 9, we now move to this tank, the SU-122-54, another Russian Tier 9 TD. This tank, with this designation, by the way, never existed. This was actually called the SU-122 SPG. It was based on the T-54A chassis. It was also known as the SU-122-54 or as the IT-122. And it's an interesting tank. I mean, it was developed in around 1949, but it wasn't until 1955 to 1957 that they started to build these things. And they built about 23 of them, funnily enough, all based on the chassis of this tank, the T-54A, or what's also known as Model 1946. There's a picture of the prototype there, of the SU-122-54 prototype. It was actually quite a successful tank. All they did was take the same parameters of the SU-100 and stick it onto a T-54 chassis. They still use them in the 1970s, and in fact we in the West got to have a look at it in some of the 1970 series victory parades, and there is a picture of one of the surviving vehicles in Kubinka Tank Museum looking pretty funky. I mean, this is why the tank is so good in the game, because it's on a T-54 chassis, it's got an amazing gun, and boy, it just looks fantastic. So now we're in the final stretch, just 2 tanks to go, and we start off with this one, the Obj-268, the Russian Tier 10 TD. Now, this tank again was only a prototype, only one was ever made, and it's based on a similar concept to the ISU, but what they did, they shaved the turret off a T10 tank, which we'll get to in a moment, and they shoved this casemate on top with a massive gun. It never saw any service, only one was ever built, and they didn't particularly like it, so it was shelved effectively. That is a T10, by the way. It's an IS-8 to those of you who are uninitiated, and that is a picture of the tank at Victory Park in Moscow. Well, the Obj-268 itself does exist. The prototype does remain, and there it is there, sat in the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia. Like I said, it was an interesting tank. They didn't particularly like it. It was an experimental vehicle, nothing more. And it was just a chance to marry a big gun to the IS-8, aka T-10 chassis. That brings us firmly to our final tank, this little beast, the Obj-263, the other Russian Tier 10 TD. Now, this tank only existed in blueprints and as a wooden mock-up. It was designed on the chassis of the IS-7 tank, the Soviet-era experimental heavy tank. There's the IS-7 there in Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia. The thing is, this was only experimental as it was anyway, and the Russians decided not to take the IS-7 program any further. So it resulted in this. This is just a wooden mock-up of what the tank would have looked like. So, that's it. That is now the end of part 2, and therefore the end of all the Russian TD series. So, I've been Fujit. Those have been the Russian TDs for part 2. Be sure to check out part 1. I hope that's been enlightening. By all means, comment and all the other stuff below. If you haven't yet, please press subscribe. It's a lovely thing to do and it puts a smile on my face. That, by the way, is the Obj-120, or aka the Tehran. So I'm leaving you with a couple of experimental Russian tanks as we leave. Until the next time, guys, I always say my usual stuff. Stay safe out there, have fun on the battlefield, and happy tanking, because you know, that is what it's all about, having fun and being happy.